The first snow of
Here,
December
Oliver, you
drifted
must
quietly
eat.
over the village
Thank
of
you, Clara.
Ashford, covering
Sir,
broken
please.
rooftops and muddy roads with a blanket of white that made even poverty appear beautiful from a distance. Inside a small stone cottage at the edge of the village, Clara Ashford carefully divided a loaf of bread into 3 pieces. She placed 2 slices onto a chipped wooden plate before gently pushing it toward her younger brother. "You eat." 12-year-old Oliver frowned. "What about you?" "I'm not hungry." "You said that yesterday." Clara smiled, though it failed to reach her tired blue eyes. "I had a large lunch." Oliver looked around the tiny kitchen. There was no sign of any lunch. No dirty dishes. No cooking pot. Only the dying embers inside the fireplace. He quietly broke one of his slices in half and placed it back on Clara's plate. "I'm not hungry either." Before Clara could protest, someone knocked sharply on the front door. 3 hard knocks. Both of them froze. Clara already knew who it was. The landlord. She opened the door before he could knock again. Mr. Harris stood outside wrapped in a heavy wool coat, his boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. "I'm afraid I've waited long enough, Miss Ashford." "I know. The rent is now 3 months overdue. I only need a little more time." "You've already had time." His voice softened slightly. "Your father was a good man." "He was. But good men cannot pay debts after they're gone." Clara lowered her eyes. "I understand." The landlord sighed. "I'll return in 1 week. If the money isn't ready." He hesitated. "I'll have no choice but to reclaim the cottage." After he left, silence filled the room once again. Oliver stared at the floor. "Are we going to lose the house?" Clara knelt beside him. "We're going to find a way." "You always say that." "Because I always believe it." He looked at her with worried eyes. "What if this time there isn't a way?" Clara gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "Then I'll make one." The following morning, Clara wrapped herself in her worn gray cloak and walked through the snow toward the village market. She spent hours asking every merchant whether they needed help. Each answer was the same. "I'm sorry. We've already hired someone." By late afternoon, her fingers had become numb from the cold. She had earned nothing. As she turned to leave the market square, an elderly woman hurried toward her. "Miss Ashford." Clara recognized her immediately. Mrs. Wilcox had once worked as a maid at Blackthorn Manor. "I've been looking for you." "For me?" "The Duke's housekeeper retired yesterday." Clara blinked. "The Duke needs another." "I've never worked in a manor." "You learn quickly." Mrs. Wilcox smiled kindly. "And more importantly, I know your heart." Clara hesitated. "I've heard stories about the Duke." "So has everyone. They say he's cruel. They say he never smiles. They say no servant lasts longer than a month." Mrs. Wilcox laughed softly. "People confuse sadness with cruelty." "What do you mean?" "The Duke isn't unkind. He's lonely." Clara looked thoughtful. "Do you think he'd hire someone like me?" "I think." Mrs. Wilcox reached into her basket and handed Clara a folded letter. "He'll at least give you the chance to try." Blackthorn Manor stood atop a hill overlooking miles of frozen countryside. Its towering stone walls and tall windows seemed almost intimidating beneath the gray winter sky. Clara had never seen such a magnificent home. Her worn boots felt strangely out of place as she climbed the marble steps. An elderly butler opened the massive oak doors before she could knock. "You must be Miss Ashford." "I am." "I'm Mr. Bennet. Please follow me." The entrance hall was larger than her entire cottage. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm candlelight across polished marble floors. Portraits of long-departed dukes watched silently from the walls. Every servant she passed moved quietly, almost cautiously. No one lingered. No one laughed. The manor felt beautiful, yet strangely empty. Mr. Bennet led her into a spacious library. A tall man stood beside the fireplace reading a leather-bound book. He wore a dark navy coat. His black hair was neatly combed. Though only in his early 30s, there was a quiet weariness in his gray eyes that made him appear older. Without looking up, he spoke. "You've come about the housekeeper's position." "Yes, Your Grace." He finally raised his eyes. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander Blackwood had expected someone older, someone stern. Instead, a young woman stood before him, wearing a faded cloak carefully patched at the sleeves. She looked exhausted, yet there was dignity in the way she carried herself. "What experience do you have?" Clara answered honestly. "Very little." "You've never managed a noble household?" "No." "You've never supervised servants?" "No." "You've never organized estate accounts?" "No." Alexander closed the book. Then why should I employ you? Clara swallowed quietly before answering. Because I won't lie to you. His expression remained unreadable. I don't know everything this position requires. But I learn quickly. I work hard. And if I make a mistake, I'll admit it. I won't blame anyone else. The room fell silent. Most applicants spent several minutes boasting about accomplishments they barely possessed. This young woman had simply told the truth. Alexander looked toward Mr. Bennet. What do you think? The old butler smiled faintly. I believe honesty is becoming rather difficult to find. Alexander looked back at Clara. When can you begin? Her eyes widened. I have the position. If you're willing. She nodded immediately. I am. Good. He returned to his book. Mr. Bennet will explain your duties. As Clara followed the butler from the room, she couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in months, hope felt possible. The following morning, Clara arrived before sunrise. The manor was still quiet. Only a few candles burned in the endless corridors, casting soft golden light across polished wooden floors. Mr. Bennet was already waiting. I like punctual people, he said with a small smile. My father always said that if you're early, you're on time. And if you're on time, you're already late. The old butler chuckled. I think we'll get along very well. He spent the morning introducing her to every department in the house. The kitchen, the laundry, the pantry, the gardens, the stable. There were nearly 40 servants living and working at Blackthorn Manor. Some greeted Clara politely. Others looked doubtful. A young housekeeper becoming their supervisor was unusual, especially one dressed in a coat that had clearly been repaired dozens of times. One maid whispered to another, "She won't last." Clara pretended not to hear. By midday, she discovered why the previous housekeeper had resigned. The manor wasn't dirty. It wasn't disorganized. It simply lacked warmth. Meals were served perfectly, but in complete silence. Servants spoke only when absolutely necessary. No flowers decorated the windows. The curtains remained closed even on sunny afternoons. Everything functioned perfectly. Nothing felt like home. While reviewing supplies in the pantry, Clara noticed something unusual. 3 shelves overflowed with expensive imported tea. Meanwhile, the servants drank weak tea made from dried herbs. She frowned. Mr. Bennet? Yes. Why don't the servants drink the same tea? He looked surprised. They never have. Why not? Because. He hesitated. That's simply how things have always been. Clara smiled gently. Perhaps it's time something changed. That afternoon, she entered the kitchen. Mrs. Carter, the head cook, looked up nervously. Have we made a mistake? No. I only have a question. What is it? How much bread do we throw away each evening? The cook looked embarrassed. Quite a lot. And why? It isn't fresh enough for the Duke's table. Clara stared at the baskets of perfectly edible bread. What happens to it? We feed most of it to the animals. She thought for a long moment. From tomorrow. She smiled. Every loaf that remains fresh will be delivered to the village orphanage. The kitchen fell silent. One young scullery maid whispered, Are we allowed to do that? Clara nodded. If anyone asks. She smiled. Tell them I ordered it. The news reached Alexander before dinner. Mr. Bennet placed the daily household report beside his plate. The new housekeeper has made several changes. Alexander looked up. Already? Yes, Your Grace. Should I be concerned? I don't believe so. Alexander opened the report. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Additional blankets sent to elderly servants. Fresh flowers placed throughout the manor. And used bread donated instead of discarded. Kitchen schedules reorganized to reduce waste. He looked toward Mr. Bennet. Did these changes increase expenses? No. They reduced them. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Interesting. He continued reading. At the bottom of the page was one final note. Miss Ashford personally repaired the torn coat of one of the stable boys instead of purchasing a new one. Alexander closed the report thoughtfully. She has only been here one day. Yes. And already the house feels different. Mr. Bennet smiled quietly. So I've noticed. That evening Clara walked home carrying her first week's wages. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She stopped at the village bakery, bought fresh bread, cheese, a small piece of smoked ham. Then, after staring at the shelf for several moments, she purchased a small apple pie. Oliver opened the cottage door before she could knock. His eyes widened. Is all that ours? She laughed. It is. He hugged her so tightly, she nearly dropped the basket. for the first time in months. They ate until neither of them was hungry. When dinner ended, Oliver quietly looked at his sister. "You smiled today. So did you. I forgot what that felt like." Clara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're going to be all right." This time, she believed it. Winter settled heavily across the countryside. Snow covered the roads almost every morning. Despite the cold, Clara never missed a day of work. She arrived before most servants awoke. She often stayed long after sunset. Not because anyone asked her to, because she genuinely cared. One particularly bitter morning, she noticed old Samuel, the head gardener, struggling to carry heavy sacks of seed across the icy courtyard. Without hesitation, she walked outside. "Let me help." Samuel looked horrified. "My lady, I'm not a lady. And you're certainly not carrying these alone." Together, they finished the work. Neither realized they were being watched. Alexander stood at his study window overlooking the courtyard. He had intended to review estate accounts. Instead, he found himself watching the new housekeeper laugh with the old gardener while snowflakes settled across her dark hair. Most supervisors gave orders. She picked up the heaviest sack herself. He couldn't explain why the sight stayed with him for the rest of the day. A week later, Alexander descended for breakfast earlier than usual. To his surprise, Clara was arranging fresh winter roses in the dining room. She immediately stepped aside. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I'll be finished in just a moment." He looked at the flowers. "I wasn't aware roses bloomed in December." "They don't." She smiled. "I found them in the greenhouse." He studied the arrangement. His late wife had always filled this room with flowers. After she died, no one had thought to continue. Until now. "They're beautiful." Clara looked pleasantly surprised. "Thank you." He hesitated. "You have a talent for making large rooms feel less empty." She lowered her eyes modestly. "I think homes should welcome people." Alexander glanced around the dining room. For years, breakfast had been a silent obligation. This morning, the room somehow felt warmer. Not because of the fire, because of the woman standing quietly beside the window. Before leaving, she paused. "I hope you enjoy your breakfast." He nodded. "I believe I already have." Clara walked away without realizing she had just made the Duke smile. Mr. Bennet, who happened to witness the exchange from the hallway, pretended not to notice. But later that evening, he would quietly tell Mrs. Carter in the kitchen, "I believe spring has arrived several months early." And for the first time in 7 long years, Blackthorn Manor no longer felt like a place haunted by silence. It was beginning, little by little, to feel like a home. A month passed almost without anyone noticing. Winter settled deeply over Blackthorn Manor, covering the gardens in glittering white and turning the nearby lake into a mirror of ice. Inside the manor, however, something remarkable had begun to happen. People smiled. Not often, not loudly, but enough that even the oldest servants whispered about it. Mrs. Carter hummed while preparing breakfast. The stable boys laughed as they swept the courtyard. Fresh flowers appeared in the entrance hall every morning. Even in the middle of winter, carefully arranged by Clara using evergreen branches, holly berries, and white roses from the greenhouse. The manor no longer felt like a museum. It felt alive. One snowy morning, Mr. Bennet found Alexander standing beside the library window. His Grace wasn't reading. He wasn't writing letters. He was watching the front courtyard. "What has your attention, sir?" the old butler asked. Alexander nodded toward the snow-covered gardens. Clara was kneeling beside a frightened puppy trapped beneath an overturned cart. The little animal trembled violently. Without hesitation, Clara removed her own wool scarf and wrapped it around the tiny creature. She carried it carefully toward the kitchens. Alexander watched until she disappeared inside. "Has she done that often?" he asked quietly. Mr. Bennet smiled. "Help those in need." Alexander nodded. "Every single day." Later that afternoon, Alexander walked through the kitchens for the first time in months. The servants immediately straightened. Mrs. Carter nearly dropped her spoon. "Your Grace." He looked around. "Where is Miss Ashford?" Mrs. Carter pointed toward a small pantry. "She is organizing tomorrow's supplies." Alexander knocked gently before entering. Clara looked up in surprise. "I didn't expect you here." "Neither did I." She laughed softly. "What brings you to the kitchen?" "I came to ask about the puppy." Her face brightened. "Oh, he'll be fine. The veterinarian came this morning." Alexander looked down. The tiny puppy was sleeping peacefully inside a basket lined with warm blankets. "You paid for the veterinarian yourself?" She shrugged. He needed help. Alexander studied her for a long moment. You spend your own wages rather freely. She smiled. I've discovered something. What is it? Money returns. She gently stroked the puppy's ears. Kindness usually does too. Alexander found himself smiling again. I believe you may be right. That evening, a heavy snowstorm struck the county. The wind howled against the windows. Several roads became completely blocked. Near midnight, frantic knocking echoed through the front entrance. Mr. Bennet hurried to answer. A young woman stood outside, carrying an unconscious child wrapped in blankets. Our bridge collapsed. She struggled to speak through tears. My son. He won't wake up. Within seconds, Clara was beside her. Bring him inside. Alexander, awakened by the commotion, descended the staircase. What happened? The child has a terrible fever, Clara answered. The village doctor cannot cross the river. Alexander didn't hesitate. Saddle my horse. Mr. Bennet looked shocked. Your Grace, the storm is too dangerous. The physician lives 6 miles away. The roads are buried beneath snow. Alexander fastened his coat. Then I'll ride across the fields. Before anyone could object, he disappeared into the storm. Nearly 3 hours passed. The wind grew stronger. Clara remained beside the little boy, cooling his forehead with damp cloths while quietly telling stories to calm his frightened mother. Just before dawn, the front doors burst open. Alexander staggered inside, covered completely in snow. Behind him hurried an elderly physician carrying a leather medical bag. The doctor immediately began treating the child. Several tense minutes passed. Finally, the fever has begun to break. The mother collapsed into tears of relief. You saved him. Alexander shook his head. The doctor saved him. The physician smiled. I wouldn't have reached him without your grace. Only then did Clara notice blood running from Alexander's gloved hand. You've been hurt. He looked down almost absent-mindedly. I must have caught it on a branch. She frowned. Sit down. It's only a scratch. That wasn't a request. Mr. Bennet struggled to hide his smile. No one had spoken to the Duke in that tone before. To everyone's surprise, Alexander obeyed. Clara carefully removed his glove. The cut was deeper than he realized. She cleaned it gently before wrapping fresh bandages around his hand. You should have been more careful. He looked at her quietly. I couldn't leave a child to die. She tied the bandage securely. I know. Their eyes met. For several seconds, the bustling entrance hall seemed to disappear. Neither noticed the servants quietly exchanging knowing smiles. The following afternoon, Alexander received an unexpected visitor. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. She stepped elegantly into the drawing room wearing a deep emerald gown and an expression polished by years of high society. My dear cousin. Alexander offered a polite nod. Lady Beatrice. I heard about your heroic ride through the storm. It wasn't heroic. It was necessary. She poured herself tea without being invited. I also hear you've hired a rather unusual housekeeper. Alexander raised an eyebrow. In what way? She's common, poor, and apparently believes servants deserve the same tea as their employers. He looked at Beatrice steadily. Is there a point to this conversation? She smiled sweetly. I'm only concerned. People may begin talking. They already do. And they say Blackthorn Manor has become kinder. Beatrice's smile faded. You've changed. Alexander looked toward the window where Clara was helping several village children build a snowman in the garden. No, he answered quietly. I believe I'm finally becoming the man I should have been all along. Lady Beatrice followed his gaze. She watched Clara laughing with the children. Something cold settled inside her heart. For years, she had expected Alexander to remain lonely. A lonely duke had no heirs, no family, and eventually, his estate might pass to distant relatives. Like her. But if that quiet young housekeeper continued changing him, everything Beatrice had quietly hoped for would disappear. She smiled politely as she finished her tea. Inside, she was already planning how to remove Clara from Blackthorn Manor forever. That evening, Clara returned home carrying another week's wages. Oliver rushed to greet her. I've got wonderful news. What is it? I was offered an apprenticeship at the village printing shop. Clara's eyes filled with pride. Oh, Oliver. That's wonderful. If I work hard, I'll be able to help you. She hugged him tightly. You've already helped me. How? By giving me a reason never to give up. Outside the cottage window, snow continued falling quietly across the village. Neither brother nor sister realized that far away, Inside the grand halls of Blackthorn Manor, someone had just decided to destroy the happiness they were beginning to build. And unlike ordinary jealousy, Lady Beatrice's plans would threaten not only Clara's position, but the future of the man who was slowly, quietly, falling in love with her. Lady Beatrice did not act immediately. She had spent years in noble society, and she understood that patience often achieved what anger never could. She waited. She smiled whenever she visited Blackthorn Manor. She complimented Clara's work. She praised the improvements made to the estate. Anyone watching would have believed the two women had become friends. Only Beatrice knew the truth. Every smile had another plan. One cold January morning, Blackthorn Manor prepared for its annual winter charity banquet. For generations, the Duke's family had hosted the event to raise money for orphanages and village schools. Nearly every noble family in the county would attend. The ballroom buzzed with activity. Servants polished crystal chandeliers. Musicians rehearsed beside the grand staircase. Florists filled every room with white lilies and winter roses. Clara supervised everything calmly. Despite the endless work, she never raised her voice. Instead, she quietly thanked every servant who completed a task. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything she did. That afternoon, he found her standing alone in the ballroom, adjusting the final arrangement of candles. "You've been working since sunrise." She smiled without turning around. "So have you. I've had several breaks. You've been reading contracts. I call that work." She laughed. "I suppose it is." He walked beside her. "You've transformed this house." "I've only rearranged a few rooms." "No." He looked around the magnificent ballroom. "You've transformed the people inside it." For a moment, Clara didn't know what to say. Compliments from the Duke were rare. When they came, they were always sincere. The banquet began just after sunset. Elegant carriages lined the long driveway. Ladies wearing sparkling gowns filled the ballroom with color. Gentlemen discussed politics beside roaring fireplaces. Music echoed beneath glittering chandeliers. Alexander greeted each guest politely. Clara remained in the background, making certain everything ran smoothly. She preferred it that way. She had never wanted attention. Unfortunately, attention found her. Near the end of dinner, the Duchess of Eastmoor approached Alexander. "Your Grace. Your Grace. I've heard remarkable things about your housekeeper." "So have I. They say she manages this estate better than most stewards." Alexander smiled slightly. "I wouldn't argue." Across the room, Lady Beatrice listened carefully. Every compliment directed toward Clara felt like another insult directed toward her. She tightened her grip around her wine glass. Tonight, everything would change. Just before the evening dance began, a sudden commotion echoed through the ballroom. "My necklace!" An elderly countess gasped. "My emerald necklace is gone." The music stopped instantly. Guests looked around in confusion. Servants froze where they stood. The countess looked desperately at Alexander. "It was here only moments ago." Alexander remained calm. "No one will leave until we locate it." The ballroom doors were quietly closed. Several servants began searching. Lady Beatrice stepped forward. "If I may make a suggestion?" Alexander nodded. "Go on." "Perhaps." She glanced toward Clara with carefully disguised hesitation. "Everyone should allow their belongings to be inspected." The suggestion sounded reasonable. One by one, guests willingly opened their handbags and coats. Nothing was found. Finally, one maid approached Clara. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss Ashford." She looked embarrassed. "But, your satchel." Clara smiled gently. "Of course." She handed it over without concern. The maid opened it. A small velvet pouch slipped onto the floor. Inside lay the missing emerald necklace. Silence swallowed the ballroom. Every guest stared. Clara's face lost all color. "I've never seen that before." The countess looked horrified. "My necklace." Lady Beatrice sighed softly. "Oh, Clara. I never imagined." Alexander looked at Clara. She met his eyes. "I didn't take it." Her voice never trembled. "I swear it." The room waited. Every noble guest expected scandal. Expected shouting. Expected immediate dismissal. Instead, Alexander calmly picked up the necklace. He handed it back to its owner. Then he turned toward the guests. "My housekeeper says she is innocent." The countess looked confused. "But the necklace?" Alexander interrupted gently. "Someone placed it there." Lady Beatrice forced a nervous smile. "Alexander. The evidence." He looked directly at her. "I trust Miss Ashford." The room became silent once again. A wealthy merchant whispered, "He's ignoring the evidence." An elderly lord quietly replied, "No, he's trusting someone's character." Alexander continued, "I have known Miss Ashford long enough to recognize honesty. If she says she did not steal this necklace, then she did not." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. No one had ever defended her so completely. Not because of proof, because of trust. Lady Beatrice hid her frustration behind another polite smile. She had expected doubt, confusion, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, Alexander hadn't hesitated for even a second. She realized she needed a better plan, one that even trust could not overcome. The banquet eventually continued. Guests danced. Music returned. Conversation slowly resumed. But Clara no longer felt comfortable. She quietly stepped outside onto the snow-covered terrace. The winter air cooled her burning cheeks. She stared across the moonlit gardens, wondering how someone could hate her enough to destroy her reputation. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You shouldn't stand out here." Alexander draped his heavy coat around her shoulders. "I needed a moment." "I know." For several minutes, they stood together in silence. Snowflakes drifted gently through the night. Finally, Clara spoke. "Why did you believe me?" Alexander looked surprised. "Because you told me the truth. But you had no proof." "I didn't need proof." She looked at him. "How?" He smiled quietly. "I've watched you give your own wages to people who had less. I've watched you repair servants' clothes instead of replacing your own. I've watched you skip meals so the stable boys could eat warm bread. You've never realized I noticed." She lowered her eyes. "I didn't do those things to be noticed." "I know." He looked at her with quiet certainty. "That's exactly why I believed you." A single tear rolled down Clara's cheek. Not because she had been accused, because someone had seen the person she truly was. Alexander gently brushed the tear away with his gloved thumb. The touch lasted only a moment. Yet both of them felt it long after his hand had fallen away. Inside the ballroom, Lady Beatrice watched through the tall glass doors. She saw the way Alexander looked at Clara. She saw the tenderness in his eyes. And in that instant, she understood something she had feared for weeks. The Duke of Blackthorn was no longer simply protecting his housekeeper. He was falling hopelessly in love with her. And if Beatrice wished to separate them, she would have to risk everything. Lady Beatrice returned to her estate that night more furious than she had been in years. She dismissed her carriage driver before the horses had fully stopped and walked directly into her private sitting room. Mrs. Holloway, her longtime companion, looked up from her embroidery. "Well," Beatrice removed her gloves with sharp, impatient movements. He defended her. Mrs. Holloway frowned. "Even after the necklace?" He never questioned her for a single moment. She poured herself a glass of wine. "I underestimated him." Mrs. Holloway studied her carefully. "No, you underestimated love." Beatrice laughed bitterly. "Love? He barely speaks to the woman." Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the quietest love is the deepest." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps it's time he discovered she isn't worthy of it. The next morning, Blackthorn Manor awoke beneath clear blue skies. Snow glittered across the gardens like thousands of tiny diamonds. Clara stepped outside carrying a basket of birdseed. Every winter, she scattered food beneath the old oak trees for the birds that remained through the cold months. As she finished, she heard footsteps behind her. "Alexander, you've made some new friends." Several robins had gathered fearlessly around Clara's boots. "They've learned I always bring breakfast." Alexander smiled. "I suspect everyone around here has learned the same." She laughed. "I only feed hungry things." He looked at her for a moment. "I noticed." They walked together along the frozen garden paths. Neither hurried to speak. The silence between them had become comfortable. It no longer felt awkward. It felt peaceful. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Alexander finally said. "What is it? If you could live anywhere in England, where would you choose?" Clara looked surprised by the question. She thought for a long moment before answering. "Honestly, always. I'd stay exactly where the people I love are." He smiled softly. "So home isn't a place." "No, it's people." Alexander looked ahead thoughtfully. "I spent years believing the opposite." Their conversation was interrupted by laughter. Several village children had wandered onto the frozen pond despite warning signs placed around its edges. Clara's smile disappeared instantly. "They shouldn't be there." Alexander nodded. "The ice is too thin." Before either of them could call out, A loud crack echoed across the pond. One little boy disappeared beneath the ice. The other children screamed. Without thinking, Alexander sprinted toward the water. Clara ran after him. The freezing pond continued breaking apart beneath the frightened child. Alexander dropped to his stomach, spreading his weight across the ice. "Hold on." The boy reached desperately toward him. The ice cracked again. Clara quickly grabbed a long tree branch lying nearby. "Alexander." He turned. She slid the branch toward him. He caught it with one hand while reaching for the boy with the other. For one terrifying moment, neither could move. Then, Alexander seized the child's wrist. Clara and two gardeners pulled together with all their strength. Finally, both the Duke and the little boy slid safely onto solid ground. The child burst into tears. Clara wrapped him in her own cloak. Alexander's clothes were soaked from the freezing water. His lips had already begun turning blue. "We need to get inside," Clara said urgently. By the time they reached the manor, the physician had been summoned. "I am." He sighed dramatically. "I appear to have lost control of my own household. I believe you lost it several weeks ago." "I suspected as much." They laughed together. On the fourth afternoon, Clara brought tea to the library. She found Alexander standing before a large portrait hanging above the fireplace. A beautiful young woman smiled gently from the canvas. Dark hair, kind eyes, a white silk gown. Clara recognized her immediately. "The Duchess." Alexander nodded. "My wife." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Clara asked quietly, "May I ask what she was like?" His expression softened. Margaret believed every problem could be solved with kindness. He smiled faintly. "She filled this house with music, flowers, laughter." He looked around the silent library. "When she died, I packed away everything that reminded me of her." Clara stepped beside him. "I don't think she would have wanted that." He looked at her. "No, I think." She smiled gently. "She would have wanted the happiness she created to continue." Alexander stared at the portrait. "I've spent 7 years trying not to remember." "Perhaps," Clara whispered, "it's time you remembered without hurting." He closed his eyes. No one had ever said those words to him before. Not his friends. Not his relatives. Not even the priests who had offered comfort after Margaret's funeral. Somehow, the young woman beside him understood grief better than anyone else ever had. Without realizing it, Alexander reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally. Neither noticed Mr. Bennet quietly walking past the open library door. The old butler smiled to himself before continuing down the corridor. Some moments were too precious to interrupt. That evening, after Clara had returned to her cottage, Alexander remained alone in the library. He stared at Margaret's portrait for a very long time. Finally, he spoke aloud. "I've been afraid." The room remained silent. "I thought loving someone again meant forgetting you." A gentle breeze stirred the curtains near the window. Alexander smiled sadly. "I think you would have liked Clara." His eyes lingered on the portrait. "And somehow, I believe you already know that." He extinguished the last candle before leaving the room. For the first time in 7 years, he no longer felt guilty for smiling. But far away, inside her own estate, Lady Beatrice unfolded a forged letter she had spent weeks preparing. This one was different. It wasn't meant to embarrass Clara. It was designed to destroy the trust between them forever. And if her plan succeeded, neither love nor kindness would be enough to keep Clara at Blackthorn Manor. Lady Beatrice spent the next several days perfecting every detail of her plan. She understood something most people did not. Lies were dangerous, but half-truths. Half-truths ruined lives. She didn't intend to accuse Clara directly. She intended to make Alexander doubt what he believed he knew. Even for a moment. Sometimes, one moment of doubt was enough to break a heart. A week later, Blackthorn Manor received an unexpected visitor. A distinguished gentleman stepped from an elegant carriage just before noon. He introduced himself as Edward Hawthorne, owner of Hawthorne Publishing in London. Mr. Bennet welcomed him politely. "I'm afraid His Grace is meeting with estate tenants. I've actually come to see Miss Ashford." Clara looked surprised when she entered the drawing room. "Mr. Hawthorne?" The gentleman smiled warmly. "You remember me." Of course. Years earlier, after Clara's parents had died, she had secretly written children's stories to earn a little money. Mr. Hawthorne had published several of them under a pen name. "I was passing through the county," he explained. "I thought you might like to know." He reached into his leather case and removed a beautifully bound book. It has become one of our best-selling children's stories. Clara's eyes widened. You printed another edition? We've already printed 4. She laughed in disbelief. I never imagined. You never gave yourself enough credit. As they talked, Alexander happened to pass through the hallway. He paused when he heard laughter coming from the drawing room. Inside, Clara and Mr. Hawthorne stood examining the beautifully illustrated book. She looked happier than he had ever seen her. For reasons he couldn't explain, a small ache settled in his chest. Mr. Bennet quietly appeared beside him. You've become very quiet. Alexander looked away from the doorway. Who is he? A publisher from London. They seem familiar. They've known each other for years. Alexander nodded slowly. I see. The old butler smiled. You don't sound convinced. Alexander gave a quiet sigh. I dislike this feeling. You felt it before. When Henry visited. Mr. Bennet chuckled. And what was Henry? A schoolteacher. And this gentleman? A publisher. The old butler folded his hands. I suspect the profession isn't the problem. Alexander couldn't argue. Later that afternoon, Edward prepared to leave. Before climbing into his carriage, he handed Clara an envelope. Your royalties. She looked embarrassed. You've already paid me generously. You earned every penny. He smiled. And I hope you'll write again someday. I've been rather busy. I noticed. He glanced toward the manor. But I believe stories have a way of finding the people meant to tell them. He bowed politely and departed. Alexander watched the carriage disappear. That evening, during dinner, he asked casually, I wasn't aware you were an author. Clara looked surprised. I never mentioned it. No. I suppose it never seemed important. What sort of stories? Children's tales. She smiled. My mother used to tell me bedtime stories. When she passed away, I started writing my own. Alexander listened carefully. May I read one? She hesitated. They're rather simple. I'd still like to. The next morning, a small book appeared on Alexander's desk. Its first page read, For the children who still believe kindness always finds its way home. He began reading before breakfast. He finished the entire book without realizing an hour had passed. When Mr. Bennet entered with the morning correspondence, he found Alexander smiling. Good story. Alexander looked up. Very. It's about a lonely robin who believes winter will never end. And it discovers spring was searching for it all along. He closed the book thoughtfully. I believe. The author understands lonely hearts remarkably well. Unfortunately, Lady Beatrice also learned about Mr. Hawthorne's visit. She smiled. This will do nicely. Mrs. Holloway looked confused. A publisher? Exactly. People already know he visited Blackthorn Manor. She unfolded a forged letter. One carefully written to appear as though Clara and Edward were secretly planning to leave England together after stealing money from the Duke's estate. Mrs. Holloway stared. That's monstrous. Beatrice's expression remained cold. No, it is necessary. 3 mornings later, Alexander received an anonymous envelope. Inside, he found the forged letter. He read it once, then a second time. His face remained expressionless. Mr. Bennet entered. Bad news, sir? Alexander silently handed him the paper. The old butler read every line, then quietly folded it. It's false. Alexander looked toward the window. I know. You do? I've learned something over these past months. What? Lady Beatrice had heard everything. She had expected questions, suspicion, arguments. Instead, Alexander hadn't even considered believing the letter. For the first time, fear entered her heart. Not fear of Clara. Fear of losing completely. If lies no longer worked, she would need something far more dangerous. Something that couldn't simply be burned in a fireplace. That night, she made a decision from which there would be no return. She would steal the Blackwood emerald brooch, the priceless heirloom that had belonged to every Duchess of Blackthorn for generations. And she would make certain it was found. In Clara's room. Unlike a necklace borrowed for an evening, the theft of a family heirloom would involve the magistrates, the courts, possibly even prison. As snow continued falling softly over Blackthorn Manor, Clara sat peacefully beside the fire, completely unaware that the greatest danger she had ever faced was already walking silently toward her. The following morning began like any other. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of Blackthorn Manor. Servants hurried through the corridors preparing breakfast. Mrs. Carter supervised the kitchens. Mr. Bennet reviewed the day's deliveries. Clara carried a notebook through the entrance hall. checking every room before the Duke's meeting with neighboring landowners. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing warned her that before the day ended, her life would change forever. Lady Beatrice arrived shortly after 10 o'clock. She greeted everyone with effortless elegance. "My dear cousin." Alexander offered a polite smile. "Lady Beatrice, I was passing nearby. I thought I'd stay for luncheon." "You are welcome." She looked toward Clara. "And Miss Ashford, I hope you're well." Clara smiled warmly. "Very well, thank you." No one noticed Beatrice's maid quietly slipping away from the drawing room. She moved silently through the upper corridor. She already knew exactly which bedroom belonged to Clara. Within seconds, the small velvet case containing the Blackwood emerald brooch disappeared beneath folded linens inside Clara's wardrobe. The maid quietly returned downstairs. No one saw her. Luncheon had barely begun when panic erupted. Mrs. Ellsworth, the elderly housekeeper who cared for the family treasures, rushed into the dining room. "Your Grace." Alexander immediately stood. "What is it?" "The Blackwood emerald brooch. It isn't in the family vault." The room became silent. Alexander frowned. "Search again." "We already have. It has vanished." Lady Beatrice slowly placed her teacup onto its saucer. "Perhaps." She looked around nervously. "Someone should search every room." Alexander disliked the suggestion, but the brooch had belonged to the Blackwood family for nearly 200 years. It was priceless. More importantly, it represented generations of family history. He nodded once. "Very well." Servants quietly searched every room in the manor. Guest chambers, storage rooms, libraries, studies. Nothing. Finally, Mrs. Ellsworth approached Clara. "I'm terribly sorry. There is only one room left." Clara nodded calmly. "Please. I have nothing to hide." Together they climbed the staircase. Alexander followed. So did Mr. Bennet. Lady Beatrice remained just behind them. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Mrs. Ellsworth opened Clara's wardrobe. She carefully lifted several folded dresses. Then suddenly, she froze. Her hand slowly emerged holding a small velvet box. The room became perfectly silent. Alexander recognized it immediately. The Blackwood family crest was embroidered in gold thread across the lid. Mrs. Ellsworth opened it with trembling hands. Inside rested the emerald brooch, exactly where Lady Beatrice intended. Several servants gasped. One young maid covered her mouth in shock. Lady Beatrice whispered softly, "Oh, no." Clara stared at the brooch. "I've never seen that before." Mrs. Ellsworth looked heartbroken. "But it was inside your wardrobe." Clara shook her head. "I don't understand." Alexander remained completely still. He looked at Clara. She met his eyes without hesitation. "I didn't steal it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Lady Beatrice sighed. "Alexander, I know this is difficult, but the evidence." Alexander slowly walked toward Clara. Every servant watched. Every guest held their breath. He stopped directly before her, then quietly asked, "Miss Ashford?" She looked at him. "Yes." "Did you place this brooch in your wardrobe?" "No." "Have you ever touched it?" "No." "Were you aware it was there?" "No." Alexander nodded once. "Very well." He turned toward everyone else. "Then she is innocent." The room erupted in stunned whispers. Mrs. Ellsworth looked bewildered. "But, Your Grace, we found it." Alexander's voice remained calm. "No, you found it in her room. Those are not the same thing." Lady Beatrice could barely hide her frustration. "You cannot simply ignore what everyone has seen." Alexander looked directly at her. "I am not ignoring anything. I am remembering something." "What?" "The woman standing before us has spent every spare coin she possesses helping strangers. She has never asked me for a single favor. She has refused expensive gifts. She repaired servants' clothes with her own hands. She skipped meals to feed hungry children." He looked around the room. "And now I'm expected to believe she suddenly stole an heirloom she could never possibly sell?" "No." He shook his head firmly. "I refuse." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not because she had been accused, because someone believed in her so completely. Mr. Bennet stepped forward. "If I may, Your Grace." Alexander nodded. "I've served this family for 42 years. I would like permission to conduct my own investigation." "You have it." Lady Beatrice smiled politely. "I'm certain the truth will reveal itself." Alexander answered quietly, "I believe it already has." She felt a chill run through her body. For the first time, she wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake. That evening, after most of the household had retired, Mr. Bennet quietly visited the servants' quarters. He spoke to every maid, every footman, every stable boy. He asked only one question. Did you notice anything unusual today? Most answered no, until a young laundry maid nervously raised her hand. She swallowed hard. I saw Lady Beatrice's maid coming out of Miss Ashford's room. Mr. Bennet looked at her carefully. Are you certain? Yes. I even apologized because I thought I'd interrupted her. What did she say? She smiled and said she was looking for the powder room. Mr. Bennet's expression darkened. The powder room is downstairs. The young maid nodded. I realized that afterward. Mr. Bennet thanked her, then quietly walked toward the library. He knew exactly who needed to hear this. Alexander listened without interrupting. When Mr. Bennet finished speaking, the Duke stood very slowly. His gray eyes had become colder than winter itself. Prepare my carriage. Tonight, sir? Immediately. Mr. Bennet understood. You intend to visit Lady Beatrice? No. Alexander's voice was frighteningly calm. I'm going to ask her one question. And if she lies? He looked toward the fire burning in the library. She will never again set foot inside Blackthorn Manor. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees. Upstairs, Clara sat alone in her room, unaware that the truth was finally beginning to emerge. And for the first time since Lady Beatrice's schemes had begun, justice was only a few hours away. Alexander left Blackthorn Manor before midnight. Snow fell heavily as his carriage raced through the dark countryside toward Ashcombe Hall. Mr. Bennet sat across from him in silence. He had known the Duke for more than 40 years. Never, not once, had he seen him so calm, and that frightened him more than anger ever could. Lady Beatrice was finishing a late supper when the front doors burst open. The butler hurried into the dining room. Your ladyship, the Duke insists on seeing you. She smiled confidently. At this hour? Show him in. Alexander entered without removing his coat. Snow still clung to his shoulders. His expression revealed nothing. Alexander. She stood gracefully. What an unexpected surprise. I've come to ask you one question. Of course. He placed the Blackwood emerald brooch on the table between them. How did this reach Clara's room? Beatrice looked genuinely offended. I have no idea. He nodded once. I was hoping you would answer differently. She laughed lightly. Surely you aren't suggesting I planted it? No. Alexander replied quietly. I'm giving you one opportunity to tell the truth. I already have. Mr. Bennet stepped forward. A maid saw your servant leaving Miss Ashford's room. Beatrice's smile faltered. My maid became lost. The powder room is on the first floor. Perhaps she misunderstood. Alexander reached into his coat pocket. I expected that answer. He unfolded another document. My coachman recognized your maid leaving the family vault earlier that morning. Beatrice's face slowly lost its color. Alexander continued. And before coming here, I visited your maid. Mr. Bennet placed a second document on the table. A signed confession. The room fell silent. Beatrice's hands trembled. You threatened her. Alexander shook his head. No. I promised to protect her if she spoke honestly. And she did. For the first time in years. Lady Beatrice had no words. Why? Alexander asked quietly. The question wasn't angry. It was almost sad. Why destroy someone who has never harmed you? Beatrice stared at the fire. Finally, she laughed bitterly. Because she took everything. Alexander frowned. What exactly did she take? You. The word echoed through the room. You stopped visiting. You stopped listening. You smiled again. You laughed. You looked at her. The way you once looked at Margaret. Tears filled Beatrice's eyes. I waited for years. I believed someday you would notice me. Alexander looked at her with genuine compassion. I never could. You never tried. No. His answer was gentle. Because my heart never belonged to you. It belonged to Margaret. He paused. And now, he looked toward the window where snow covered the gardens outside. It belongs to Clara. The truth shattered the last of Beatrice's hope. She lowered her head. I suppose I always knew. Alexander picked up the brooch. Tomorrow morning, you will write a full confession. It will be delivered to every noble family who attended the banquet. You will publicly clear Clara's name. And afterward, his voice became firm. You will never return to Blackthorn Manor. Beatrice closed her eyes. I understand. As Alexander turned to leave, she spoke one final time. Does she know? He paused. Know what? That you love her. A faint smile appeared on his face. I don't think she does. You should tell her. He looked back. I intend to. The carriage ride home was silent. Mr. Bennet finally smiled. I believe congratulations are in order. For what? You've finally admitted it. Alexander looked out into the snowy darkness. I suppose I have. The next morning, every servant gathered in the entrance hall. Alexander stood beside Clara, Mrs. Ellsworth, Mrs. Carter, Samuel, the stable boys. Every member of the household waited anxiously. Alexander unfolded Beatrice's written confession. He read every word aloud. The forged evidence, the planted brooch, the lies. When he finished, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Carter walked forward. She hugged Clara tightly. One by one, every servant followed. The young laundry maid who had revealed the truth burst into tears. I'm so sorry. I should have spoken sooner. Clara embraced her gently. You spoke when it mattered. Alexander waited until everyone had quietly returned to work. Then he turned toward Clara. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. For what? I should have protected you sooner. You did. No. I allowed you to suffer even for one day. She smiled softly. Sometimes, the people we love get hurt. What matters is whether we stand beside them. The word lingered in Alexander's mind. Love. Did she realize what she had just said? Perhaps she didn't. Or perhaps she did. A week later, Blackthorn Manor prepared for its annual winter ball. This year, however, there was an unexpected announcement. Alexander had personally instructed Mr. Bennet to invite every servant to attend the celebration after the noble guests departed. It has never been done before, Mr. Bennet said. Alexander smiled. Then its time it was. The ballroom sparkled beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Music drifted through the halls. Guests admired the decorations. Once again, everyone praised Blackthorn Manor. But this time, no one whispered about scandal. They whispered about the mysterious change in the Duke. He's smiling. I've seen him laugh. Who is responsible? Many eyes quietly turned toward Clara. She pretended not to notice. Alexander noticed enough for both of them. Near the end of the evening, after the noble guests had departed, the orchestra prepared to leave. Alexander stopped them. One more dance. The conductor smiled. For whom, Your Grace? Alexander looked across the ballroom. Clara stood near the doorway, thanking the last departing servant. He walked toward her. Every servant in the room became perfectly silent. He stopped only inches away. Miss Ashford. She looked up. Yes, Your Grace. Would you honor me with this dance? Her eyes widened. The servants are watching. I know. I'm only the housekeeper. He smiled gently. No. He offered his hand. You're the woman who brought this house back to life. The orchestra began playing. Clara slowly placed her hand in his. As they stepped onto the empty dance floor, every servant quietly smiled. Mr. Bennet discreetly wiped a tear from his eye. Mrs. Carter whispered, I've waited years to see this. Alexander gently placed one hand around Clara's waist. She looked up at him. You've changed. He smiled. No. You changed me. The music carried them slowly across the ballroom. Outside, snow continued falling over Blackthorn Manor. Inside, two lonely hearts, who had spent years believing happiness belonged to other people, discovered that sometimes love arrived quietly, not with grand promises, but with simple acts of kindness repeated every single day. And neither of them yet realized that before spring arrived, Alexander would ask Clara the one question that would change both of their lives forever. Spring arrived earlier than anyone expected. The snow melted from the hills surrounding Blackthorn Manor, revealing fields covered with fresh green grass and countless wildflowers stretching toward the horizon. For the first time in years, every window of the manor stood open. Warm air drifted through the halls. Birdsong replaced silence. The entire estate seemed to breathe again. Mr. Bennet often said the house had been asleep for 7 years. Now, it had finally awakened. One bright morning, Clara was arranging fresh tulips in the entrance hall when Oliver burst through the front doors. His cheeks were flushed from excitement. Clara, she laughed. What has happened? He held up a folded letter. I've finished my apprenticeship. Her eyes widened. So soon. The printer has offered me a permanent position. Oh, Oliver. She hugged him tightly. I knew you could do it. I couldn't have done it without you. Alexander happened to enter the hall just in time to witness the reunion. Oliver immediately straightened. Your Grace. Alexander smiled warmly. I hear congratulations are in order. Oliver nodded proudly. I've been hired. Then I believe the occasion deserves celebrating. That evening, the Duke surprised everyone by insisting Oliver remain for dinner. The young man had never imagined eating beside a Duke. His hands trembled so badly that he nearly dropped his spoon. Alexander quietly pretended not to notice. Instead, he asked Oliver about printing presses, books, and village life until the nervous boy relaxed completely. Watching them together, Clara realized something that made her heart ache. Alexander wasn't being polite. He genuinely cared. Several days later, Mr. Bennet approached Alexander with an unusual request. The village school requires a new roof. Alexander looked up from his desk. How much? The butler named the amount. Alexander reached for his pen. Mr. Bennet smiled. I had a feeling you would approve. Alexander paused. No. Double it. Mr. Bennet looked surprised. Double. The children also need books. And proper desks. The old butler chuckled softly. I suspect Miss Ashford has been influencing you. Alexander smiled. I certainly hope so. That afternoon, Clara accompanied Alexander to inspect the school. The children greeted them with enthusiastic cheers. One little girl ran directly toward Clara carrying a bouquet of daisies. These are for you. Clara knelt beside her. They're beautiful. The little girl turned toward Alexander. And these? She held out a single daisy. Are for the Duke. Alexander accepted it with complete seriousness. Thank you. As they walked through the classrooms, Clara noticed several cracked windows. The books were worn. The furniture was old. Alexander quietly wrote notes in a small leather notebook. She glanced at the page. New books. New roof. New windows. Warm lunches. A small library. She looked at him. You've written everything. He smiled. You would have. On the journey home, their carriage passed a meadow filled with blooming wildflowers. Clara looked out the window. It's beautiful. Alexander immediately called to the driver. Stop here. The carriage came to a halt. They climbed down and wandered slowly through the meadow. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms across the hills. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. Do you remember your first day at Blackthorn Manor? Clara laughed softly. I was terrified. So was I. She looked at him in surprise. You? I believed hiring another housekeeper would change nothing. And instead, he smiled. You changed everything. He reached into his coat pocket. Mr. Bennet, watching discreetly from the carriage, smiled to himself. He had been waiting weeks for this moment. Alexander removed a small velvet box. Clara looked confused. What is this? Open it. Inside rested a delicate gold ring. At its center sparkled a modest sapphire surrounded by tiny pearls. It wasn't the largest jewel in England. It wasn't the most expensive, but it was beautiful. Alexander took a slow breath. I've rehearsed this speech for 3 days. She couldn't help smiling. Really, I was dissatisfied with every version. So, he laughed nervously. I'll simply tell you the truth. He gently took both of her hands. When you first came to Blackthorn Manor, I believed I was hiring someone to care for my home. His voice softened. You cared for my heart instead. I believed I had nothing left to give. You proved me wrong. You taught me that kindness is not weakness, that hope can survive grief, and that love, he smiled through emotion, sometimes arrives quietly. He looked into her eyes. Clara Ashford, I don't want you to remain my housekeeper. I don't even want you simply to remain in my life. I want you to become my wife. I want every morning, every Christmas, every spring, every ordinary day that follows. If you'll have me. The meadow fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes. You've forgotten something. Alexander looked worried. I have. You never asked. He laughed softly. You're right. He lowered himself onto one knee among the wildflowers. Clara Ashford, will you marry me? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she laughed through her tears, then gently pulled him to his feet. Yes. She whispered. Yes. I'll marry you. Before another word could be spoken, she threw her arms around him. Alexander held her tightly as the warm spring breeze swept across the meadow. From the carriage, Mr. Bennet discreetly turned away. Some moments deserved privacy, though he couldn't stop smiling. News spread through the county within days. The Duke of Blackthorn was marrying his housekeeper. Society reacted exactly as expected. Some noble families were shocked. Others were amused. Several openly criticized the engagement. At one elegant dinner party, a wealthy lord remarked, "A duke marrying a servant? It will never last." An elderly duchess quietly replied, "Perhaps, but I have never seen a happier duke." The conversation ended there. Clara, however, worried about one thing. One evening she confessed her fears. "What if people never accept me?" Alexander looked at her gently. "They don't have to." "They don't." "No." He smiled. "They only need to respect the woman I love. And if they refuse, then they are welcome to stay away from Blackthorn Manor." She laughed. "You make everything sound simple." It usually is. Their wedding took place on the first Saturday of June. Not in London's Grand Cathedral, but in the small village church where Clara's parents had been married years before. The entire village attended. Every servant from Blackthorn Manor filled the front pews. Mrs. Carter cried before the ceremony even began. Mr. Bennet claimed something had gotten into his eyes. No one believed him. As Clara walked down the aisle in a simple ivory gown, Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her. She wasn't wearing a diamond crown. She wasn't covered in jewels. She didn't need them. To him, she had never looked more beautiful. When the minister asked, "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Alexander answered without hesitation, "With all my heart." "And do you take this man to be your husband?" Clara smiled through happy tears. "With all my heart." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the church bells rang joyfully across the valley. Outside, children threw flower petals instead of rice. Oliver embraced his sister. "I knew you'd find happiness." She smiled. "So did you." Alexander slipped his hand into hers. "I believe we're going home." She looked at Blackthorn Manor waiting in the distance. "No," she whispered with a smile. "We already are." The years passed more quickly than either Alexander or Clara ever expected. Blackthorn Manor, once known as the coldest estate in the county, became famous for something entirely different. Its doors were always open. Travelers caught in storms found warm meals waiting for them. No child was ever turned away hungry. Every Christmas, the great hall that had once echoed with silence filled with laughter, music, and hundreds of villagers sharing dinner beneath the glittering chandeliers. People no longer spoke about the Duke, who never smiled. They spoke about the Duke and Duchess who changed an entire county with kindness. One of the first promises Alexander fulfilled after their wedding was building a new school beside the village church. Not a small school. When questioned about the decision, Alexander simply smiled. "If knowledge belongs to everyone," he would say, "education should as well." Clara spent several mornings each week reading stories to the youngest students. Many of those stories were the same ones she had secretly written years before under her pen name. The children never knew they were listening to the author herself. They only knew the Duchess who always had time to read one more chapter. Oliver also found the future he had once dreamed about. The small printing shop where he had begun as an apprentice soon became one of the busiest publishing houses in the county. With Alexander's encouragement, he expanded the business until books reached villages that had never before owned a library. One afternoon, he surprised Clara with the first novel published under her real name. She held the beautifully bound book in trembling hands. "You printed it." Oliver grinned. "I told you your stories deserve to carry your own name." Alexander wrapped an arm around his wife. "I've been waiting years to see your name on the cover." Clara laughed through happy tears. "I suppose I finally ran out of excuses." The book became a favorite among families throughout England, not because it was written by a duchess, but because every page reminded people that kindness could change lives. As for Lady Beatrice, she honored the agreement she had made. She publicly confessed to framing Clara. Many noble families turned away from her after learning the truth. For several years, she lived quietly on a small inherited estate far from Blackthorn Manor. Then, one autumn afternoon, an unexpected letter arrived. It was addressed to Clara. Inside was a short message. "I spent too many years believing that another person's happiness stole my own. I was wrong. I cannot undo what I did, but I hope someday you will remember me with pity instead of anger. I truly am sorry." Clara read the letter twice before folding it carefully. Alexander looked at her. "Will you answer?" She nodded. "I think I should." "What will you say?" She smiled softly. "That forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows the future to begin." Several weeks later, Beatrice received Clara's reply. No one ever learned exactly what it said, but those who knew Beatrice noticed she became quieter, kinder, and spent much of her remaining life supporting orphanages and widows. Sometimes redemption began with a single act of mercy. 3 years after their wedding, joyful cries echoed through Blackthorn Manor once again. Their first child was born, a daughter with Clara's bright blue eyes and Alexander's dark hair. They named her Rose Margaret Blackwood. Rose, for the flowers that had returned to the manor. Margaret, in honor of the woman whose memory had taught Alexander that love never truly disappeared. When Alexander held his daughter for the first time, tears filled his eyes. Clara smiled. "I've never seen you cry." "I have." He laughed quietly. "I've simply become better at hiding it. You don't have to hide anything anymore." "I know." He kissed both his wife and daughter gently. "And that's the greatest gift you've ever given me." 2 years later, a son arrived. Then another daughter. Blackthorn Manor became wonderfully noisy. Tiny footsteps echoed through corridors that had once known only silence. The library filled with toys. The gardens became places for hide-and-seek instead of lonely walks. Alexander often returned early from estate meetings simply to hear his children laugh. One evening, Clara found him sitting on the floor building a wooden castle with their son. She leaned against the doorway smiling. The Duke of Blackthorn, defeated by a 5-year-old knight. Alexander looked up. "I surrendered with honor," their son proudly declared. "I won." "You certainly did," Alexander replied. Clara watched the scene with quiet gratitude. Years ago, she had accepted a position at Blackthorn Manor only to save her brother from poverty. She had never imagined she would one day build a family there. Time continued moving forward. Mr. Bennet eventually retired after serving the Blackwood family for nearly 50 years. On his final day, the entire household gathered in the entrance hall. Alexander handed him a polished oak box. Inside rested a gold pocket watch engraved with the words, "To the man who never stopped believing in happier endings." The old butler struggled to speak. "I've watched 3 generations of this family grow." He looked at Clara. "But these," he smiled warmly, "have been the happiest years of all." Even after retirement, Mr. Bennet visited every Sunday for afternoon tea. The children adored him. He always claimed he came for the tea. No one believed him. Years turned into decades. The gray strands in Alexander's hair multiplied. Fine lines appeared around Clara's eyes whenever she smiled. Neither minded. Every wrinkle carried a memory. Every gray hair represented another year spent together. One warm summer evening, they sat beneath the old oak tree where birds still gathered every morning. Alexander reached for Clara's hand exactly as he had done so many years before. "Do you remember your first day here?" She laughed softly. "I remember thinking this house was too large. And now." She looked toward the manor. Children chased one another across the lawn. Grandchildren laughed beside the fountain. Servants and family shared supper together in the garden. It finally became the home it was always meant to be. Alexander nodded. "You were right." "About what?" "Home isn't a place." He gently squeezed her hand. "It's people." They sat quietly as the sun disappeared beyond the hills. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the gardens. The very same gardens that had once felt empty now overflowed with life. After a long silence, Alexander smiled. "Do you know the greatest decision I ever made?" Clara looked at him playfully. "Hiring a housekeeper?" He laughed. "No, falling in love with her." She rested her head against his shoulder. "And do you know the greatest decision I ever made?" "What?" Walking through the doors of Blackthorn Manor, they watched the last rays of sunlight fade into twilight. Around them, laughter drifted through the gardens. Children played. Birds sang. The manor glowed warmly beneath the evening sky. Love had not arrived with grand speeches or impossible miracles. It had arrived quietly, through shared meals, gentle smiles, small acts of kindness, a hand offered when someone needed help, a heart willing to trust when doubt seemed easier. And because 2 lonely people chose compassion instead of pride, an empty house became a joyful home. A grieving man learned to love again, and a young woman who believed she had nothing to offer discovered she was the greatest treasure of all. The end.